welcome everyone to Hanover's most recent webinar. All of you will have seen our invite through Hanover, so I'm sure you know who we are, but just to reiterate, we do have our 4 key pillars. They're, of course, the executive search, market intelligence, leadership solutions, and outplacement solutions. So we will have a follow-up after this event, so if you're interested in any of these services or having a follow-on discussion, we'd certainly welcome that as well. So today I have one of the, if not the most distinguished speaker I've ever had the pleasure of talking with, Robert Wigley. We'll run through a Q&A between myself and Robert. I'll then pass to my colleague Richard Waddell, who leads our Leadership Solutions division. I'm sure he'll have some questions of his own, and Richard will also be managing the Q&A chat box at the bottom for any questions that come through from the audience. So Robert is currently the chair of UK Finance and ex-EMEA chairman of Merrill Lynch, board member of the Bank of England during the 2008 financial crisis. What a ringside seat to have in such a momentous time for us all. So for today, Robert will be sharing his experience and we'll discuss his book, Born Digital, and how to attract, retain, and motivate Gen Z, the future of work, and regulation of big tech. So Robert, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. You've had an extraordinary career in finance and more recently in fintechs. It would be good for myself and the audience today if you could tell us a bit more about your career and journey this far.
Sure. So I started life as a chartered accountant after I graduated with a business degree. Worked for about 18 months in financial consulting. Then joined a British merchant bank called Morgan Grenfell, where I worked for 10 years during the height of the sort of 80s and early 90s takeover boom. I then was headhunted to build Merrill Lynch's European business. I was there 16 years, latterly as the chairman of EMEA, with, in the end, 9,000 people in 23 countries and about a half $1 trillion of gross assets on the balance sheet, half in London, half in Dublin. And I left, you mentioned that I was asked to join the board of the Bank of England for the period of the financial crisis to try and help steer the resolution of that situation. And then I left banking after the financial crisis. I worked in public companies for a few years. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I started helping young entrepreneurs in cutting edge technology businesses. That's what I spend most of my time doing. 4 years ago, I was asked to chair this organization, UK Finance, which represents the UK financial services sector. I do some academic work at Oxford, Cambridge, and a university in Australia where I'm a visiting professor. Do quite a lot of philanthropic work with St John's Ambulance, Cancer Research UK, and the Royal Marines.
Wow, amazing stuff. And I think I picked up on your book, Robert. You mentioned there's some parallels between the financial crisis, which, as you said, you had a ringside seat on at the time, and what you're currently calling the distraction crisis. Could you just elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So the book Born Digital: The Story of a Distracted Generation is about Generation Z. It's about the way that technology affects their behaviors, the development of their personalities, the way they see the world, and ultimately the value system that they are developing. Not just as a result of technology, also partly as a result of societal trends like decline of religion, decline of marriage, actually decline of communal eating, a whole range of things that when we grew up we thought were completely the norm that have now definitely become not the norm. I suppose what I observe in the book is the ways in which technology drives their attention and distracts their attention from what they may wish to attend to. And the reason I think that this is similar to what happened in the lead up to the financial crisis is the following: that the financial system sort of developed over 40 years, bit by bit, day by day, as innovation took businesses forward, and regulation and governance of banks and financial services organizations didn't keep up with that innovation. And so we ended up, sadly, with the financial crisis. I think the same has happened in the tech arena. I think we've had 10 years of massive technological change, during which time mobile devices, laptops, gaming consoles, earbuds have all become completely ubiquitous in almost every aspect of our lives. And regulation has not caught up with the fact that during that same 10-year period, adolescent well-being has declined dramatically. And whether you look at any score of loneliness, unhappiness, ultimately anxiety, depression, self-harm, and even suicide, these what I call the negative factors have grown dramatically, and we haven't had the regulation to try and address that issue. So that's why I think there's a parallel with the financial crisis, or at least with the period leading up to the financial crisis.
Yeah. So I know it's quite evident from your book, you saw written it during lockdown, where all this would have been magnified. Now you did choose to write a book on the effects on technology on Generation Z, and there's a lot of recommendations of how we can regulate ourselves, but also more from an actual legal regulatory perspective to regulate big tech. So it's not an obvious topic for an ex-banker and lifetime supporter of the free markets, Robert. So would you mind just joining the dots together and maybe giving us an insight?
Yes. So why did I write it? Well, partly because I've got 3 adolescent children, so I've been watching them grow up and watching their personalities develop, and watching the effects of technology on them. About 2 years ago, I made a New Year's resolution to try and meet a new Generation Z entrepreneur every business day. So I actually met a little over 200, and it was those meetings which cemented my view that Generation Z is not a little different from my generation. It's 180 degrees different. And the great danger is that our generation says, well, when they grow up, they'll grow out of it, or it'll be different, or it'll go back to how it used to be. Well, it isn't going to. They aren't going to. This generation is absolutely fundamentally different from our generation in the way it looks at the world, partly actually because of the pretty weak hand of cards that we're leaving them. And whether you think about the sort of continuing global war on terror that's existed throughout most of their lives, whether it be the damaged planet that we're delivering them, more recently COVID debt, or just the austerity hangover from the financial crisis. I mean, if I was an 18-year-old today, I don't think I'd be massively thanking my generation for what we're leaving them. And that drives very much the way they look at the world, their desire for independence, their understanding that they need to be independent, their quest for entrepreneurialism, their view of the importance of business to solving societal problems, climate change, and ultimately what I know we're going to come on to talk on later, which is purpose. So yeah, that's why I've written the book. I wanted to try and join up the dots for people my age who maybe haven't figured it out, and help us all think about how we could help this generation, both in terms of their own self-regulation when it comes to the internet, but also how governments probably need to act.
Yeah, so I know it's in the news at the moment about the tax on those companies as well. So I think the regulations falling behind that. So I think we're going to try a poll now, Robert. My colleague Julia will hopefully be able to pop it up. We're just going to ask the audience if they think that the big techs should be regulated or not, which hopefully will be coming up on your screen now. It's just a simple yes or no, so we can get temperature of the water. It's looking quite conclusive, Robert. I don't know if you can see.
I can't see the answers at the moment, no, but
I'll come up in a second. 89% saying it should be regulated, Robert.
That's encouraging, because I totally agree.
So perhaps consider a career in politics. Such a
No, definitely not.
argument. So you mentioned the values and purpose there, and it's something that I discuss a lot because it is important, particularly with engagement, and some of that was lost last year whilst we were working from home and adapting to it, as opposed to being in the office. And you mentioned in the book it's moving front and center of people's minds, and that what makes Generation Z tick and the value systems they've developed is a lot different. And so can you take us through your thoughts and how that's going to affect businesses?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the kind of summary is that Generation Z looks for choice, convenience, efficiency, fast and frictionless service, or a frictionless customer journey. That's partly the way they think, but it's partly out of necessity, because many of them are early stages of their careers because of their age. They don't have much money. Interestingly, half of 13 to 17-year-olds know what a credit score is. I certainly didn't know what one was when I was 17. And extraordinarily, 91% of Generation Z is already saving for its retirement. That's a pretty scary statistic. So I think we've told them you're not going to have pensions like we did. So, you know, they're actually thinking, God, I need to sort out my future. So the next, I think, big one is the underlying value that there is minimal commitment. And that's, of course, the principle that underlies the sharing or gig economy. The idea that we can rent, not buy assets. I think in my generation, we wanted to own our home, own our car. Now, I think it's all about owning an asset just for as long as you need it, for the purpose you need it, and then hand it back to someone else who can take the risks of ownership. Or another way of putting that is that experiences are more important than assets. This is something I know the founder of Airbnb is very supportive of. And if you look at the way he's building his business model, it's not just about renting a flat, it's about everything that happens while you're at the flat, and making sure you have a good experience in the widest sense in and out of the flat. The next big one is hyper-personalization. So just as they experience through algorithmic advertising, hyper-personalization of social media services, they, of course, themselves become celebrity personalities on social media by being able to be themselves, whatever that means. People supplying physical products and services will need to hyper-personalize them. So if you look at companies like Nike, with Nike ID, where you personalize your trainers, or Calvin, where you can personalize underwear, or Lacoste, where you can choose your exact combination of, you know, banding and buttons on shirts. Gen Z basically wants to be able to personalize their clothing and their brands in general as a reflection of their own personalization. They will expect actually the internet to predict what they need and alert them to it before they need it. And many of them will simply stop going to a website if it doesn't somewhat anticipate what they like, need, or want. The next big one is sustainability. So I mentioned the climate crisis. Gen Z will expect in its brands an absolute focus on sustainability in the widest sense. Actually, most of them say they're prepared to pay more for sustainable offerings. And sustainability is, in a sense, is a subset of purpose, which I know we're going to come back later, so I won't talk about purpose now. But the whole idea of brands taking stands, as we call it, I think is very important. The next big trend is peer-to-peer feedback, which is rated much more highly than that from, in the old days, we might look to a celebrity or a TV personality to give us a recommendation. Now it's about peer-to-peer recommendation and peer-to-peer feedback, which is most highly recognized, including, of course, influencers. So influencer marketing spend is going to be $10 billion by the end of 2020. And interestingly, Gen Z in the surveys say they don't actually find influencers particularly authentic, but they do still listen to them and follow their recommendations. It's important, I think, for advertisers to understand which influencers are the ones that will give them the best value. It's not necessarily the biggest ones. Sometimes micro-influencers that have a particular standing in a particular niche may be more relevant. The whole basis of advertising is going to change. So we'll move to shorter, more entertaining video-based ads, a bit like the kind of thing you might see on TikTok. And brands will need to think not just about their products, but how they address what I call EQ, or the entertainment quotient, going back to this idea that owning an asset is about an experience, not simply the ownership of an asset. And if you think about it, all those things I've just mentioned are entirely logical values, given the kind of hand of cards that we're leaving to this generation. And any business that doesn't understand those trends and isn't reorienting its business towards those trends is misunderstanding that its future will rely on Generation Z's digital wallet. And I think if you want me to sum that up, I think it's kind of three things. Actually, McKinsey said this. It's about consumption as access, not possession. It's about consumption as an expression of their own identity. And then finally, it's consumption as a matter of ethical concern. Those, I think, are the three values that underlie Generation Z's value system.
Yeah, and you also mentioned in the book, which is relevant to me as a recruiter, and I think most of our participants will be in some form of leadership function as well, about attracting, retaining, and developing Gen Z, which is so important, because I think it's easy to criticize the new generations for being different and all these other reasons for that. But of course, they are the next generation, and as a leader, it's important to engage and develop them properly. So, I mean, what advice would you have for us on that regard?
Yeah, so I think I have a chapter in the book which talks about the office pilots who work in phygital workplaces. So just to unpack that, phygital meaning the combination of physical and digital, which is the way Gen Z will see the office and the workplace. In other words, just as they don't see a difference between the on and offline world, it's all one to them. So I think the workplace is not a physical office where they go. It's just a period of time when they're working, which could be in the office, it could be on the bus on the way to or from, or it could be on the laptop at home. That's why I call them phygital workplaces. And the office pilots kind of thing is what I see in most of my tech businesses. Is the youngsters come in first thing in the morning, find a desk sitting between two other people, crack open 3 devices, fire them up, put the earbuds in, and off they go. Ironically, the 2 human beings they probably don't talk to all day are the 2 people sitting in the next door booths, who, by the way, tomorrow are 2 different people, because this is a work, an office sharing facility. So you don't have that sense of community maybe in the office place that we had when we were growing up. So what does that mean for the employer? Well, it means firstly that from the very first moment Gen Z interacts with your company, they will assess you in relation to your degree of digital sophistication. And that means that when it comes to the application process, they will expect a streamlined customer journey, in inverted commas, just as they would expect as a customer. They're not interested in spending hours filling in long CV and application forms online. They want video-based processes, what we call snapplications. And actually, interestingly, some of the leading firms in the world are already using this kind of technology. So McDonald's now recruit their branch staff through Snapchat. Goldman Sachs, would you believe, is actually recruiting some graduates through TikTok by creating little snappy videos talking about what it's like to work at Goldman Sachs. But that will work its way through, not just through the application and onboarding process, but to appraisals, to how you inform your colleagues of what's going on in your business, to staff surveys. All of those must be streamlined, video-based, quick, easy, bite-sized, because that's the way Gen Z will expect to work. I think the next one is that they're really looking for what I call experiences, not jobs. So we might have gone to a big company with a big brand name that was making a lot of money, expected to be there 5 to 10 years, progress through the ranks. That's not the way they're looking at it. They want an experience. So they're looking for shorter term roles, things that are more project based, more customization, a high degree of training, and you should expect that they will job hop more. So the attitude of, I think, take, learn and move. The founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, describes working at his company as a tour of duty. He says it's rotational, it's to learn, it's potentially transformational to that person's career and for the company. And it's foundational in terms of its long-term value, but it's temporary. I think the next thing is that they're very much looking for what I call benefits, not salaries. So again, in our day, we might have expected an annual salary increments, maybe a day of extra holiday every few years, whatever. For them, the workplace itself, the environment, the culture, the location of the office. The office needs to be cool, and it needs to be in a cool location. They will expect to be able to remote work and flexi time. They will expect to be able to take holidays, not necessarily in a standard format, maybe more holiday than their allowance. They will absolutely expect healthcare, given what we've told them about what we're doing to our NHS. They will expect to be able to take paid time off, and they'll expect access to their salary, not just at the end of the month, but at any point in the month they want to draw on it. So those kind of mechanisms of everyday access to pay schemes will be very important. They'll expect to be heard in the workplace, I think, much more than maybe we did. So these staff surveys need to be more often, more interactive, simpler, but they also need to show that we're listening and taking into account their views in the way that we run our businesses. We should expect them probably not just to have one job. They may well want to have a side hustle. They may want to have their own little business on the side. And all of that, when you add it up, will need to flow through to the way that we design the workplace. So we should expect, more co-working spaces to accommodate the office pilots. We should expect to try and have to create a sort of social hub in the office. We should expect biophilic offices. In other words, we need to bring the environment into the office because this generation is very focused on the environment. We should expect to use AR and VR as our ideation tools. And we will have to think very carefully about how we address the challenge of facilitating deep work in a very distracted environment. So that's kind of my summary of how employers need to look at it. It is fundamentally different from what we grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, the digital workplaces, I mean, spelled PH for anyone wants to Google it, was a new word for me, but it was so interesting whilst I was reading it, because we are at that point now where we're largely at home, but about to start going back into the office. And a lot of companies are still a bit unsure about what they're going to do in the next 6 to 12 months and trying to find that balance. And if I could just ask a question related to the last one, Robert, so I'm curious what your thoughts are, but for me, alongside the engagement as well, for me, one big thing that's missing is mentorship. And I think if I look at my career, I've learned a lot through being in an office and around people, learning by osmosis and that mentorship. So, I mean, how would you advise leaders to still navigate that in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, I think probably in the environment I've described is even more important, because it'll actually be the mechanism by which you keep in touch with your fleeting, if you like, employees, or colleagues. So companies will need to think very hard about how they connect with their employees in a situation where they may not be so physically present. That's absolutely fundamental, I think. Yeah.
And the final point for me, we're just going to run a final poll just related to that point before I pass on to my colleague Richard Waddell, who I mentioned. He runs our Leadership Solutions division. So I'm sure he'll have his own questions, and also he'll be monitoring the Q&A box at the bottom. So if anyone does have questions, just pop them in that box, and Richard will be able to ask Robert afterwards. So the next poll, and it's as much for my own interest because it does come through a lot in conversations, is does this flexible remote working environment increase or decrease productivity? Or indeed, you might think it stays the same. So more of a mixed result this time. This is quite exciting, actually. I like the polls. I'll have to do these again. I think that's us. 67% believe that flexible remote working increases productivity, Robert. 10% believe that it decreases.
So I think you've got to unpack. I mean, I think I agree with that broadly. I think you've got to unpack it a little bit. So one of the obvious ways that remote working increases productivity is you don't spend 3 hours a day wasting time getting to and from work. So there's just more time available. Okay. The thing I would say, though, is how do we address innovation? We will need to think very carefully, and culture. How do you instill a culture in an organization that you've never physically worked in? And how do you innovate and spark off colleagues online as opposed to physically? And it's not that it can't be done, it's just that it needs a different way of thinking. So they're the big challenges, I think, for management. Yeah. And people are already have developed tools to do that, but we will need to think very consciously about how we instill culture and how we embrace and encourage innovation and capture innovation in a remote world. On the flip side, I do think that the effect of technology in terms of distraction is a worry. So one of the things I calculated in my book is if you literally could find a way of people spending half an hour less a week on their mobile phone being distracted by social media messaging, right, what would that do to national productivity? And I think the output is about 50 billion of GDP, which is roughly equivalent to the education budget or a third of the NHS budget last year. And that's if it's only half an hour. I suspect the true answer would be a lot higher than that. So I do think we'll need to think about how technology, while on the one hand enabling remote working, when you are in the workplace, and I mean, I noticed this when I was writing my book, you sit down to write, and then the phone pings or it buzzes or something flashes up, and immediately you're distracted. Your productivity goes down. And I think the interesting question, there are really two. I expect we'll come back to this with Richard, but one is just at the moment when AI is developing to the point that basic work will disappear, and the only jobs that are left for human beings are the really complex ones that only humans can do. Are we just at that moment teaching our kids to multitask? And what the science will tell you, in other words, they graze like digital bees on multiple information pots, and they flit from job to job. What the scientists will tell you is there's no such thing as efficient multitasking. There's just inefficient serial multitasking, right? That's what the science tell you. So the idea that you can train yourself to be as effective doing three things at once is for most people just not true. So I think there's a whole subject in there for those who study the way people work and design workplaces and the way colleagues interact with each other and their employers, that we'll have to think about productivity in this new remote and flexible environment, and indeed just in a phygital workplace.
100% agree. So I'll pass you over to Richard now, who hopefully ask some questions come through, and then I'll join again at the end for closing statement.
Robert, thank you, and some very interesting insights into, for example, what Gen Z look for and expect in the workplace, in their career, and in the roles that might engage them. From my perspective, one of the things I'm really interested in is leadership, and specifically what Gen Z individuals expect from leaders in the organizations they work for, and how this perhaps differs from previous generations. So when they look up at the people they aspire to be, or they admire, what are those things that you think that they're looking for?
So I think there are two overriding values or characteristics that they're going to look for. One is a demonstration of purpose, and the second is inclusivity. So just taking the first, when we grew up, we understood the capitalist model. Companies exist to make profits for their shareholders and pay dividends. That's kind of what companies do. Because of the world that we're leaving Generation Z, they believe that businesses exist to solve societal problems and to make some money. But it's definitely at least 50-50 or that way around. It's not basically they're there to make profits and then do a bit of CSR on the side that makes it look like you're also trying to do some good for society. Okay, it's definitely the other way around. So, and in business, I think we are developing now this clear idea around purpose. The businesses need to explain not just to their employees actually, but to their customers what their purpose is, and that purpose needs to have something that goes beyond making money. 93% of Generation Z in the surveys I read said their decision to work for a company would be affected by the company's impact on society. And 85% believe that companies should be obligated to solve societal problems. That's how strong the feeling is and how different it is. So I think we're entering this period of what I call the purpose-driven era. That's actually a term developed by Professor David Grayson, who's written many books on the subject, where the best corporate leaders look at what they do through the lens of the purposeful and positive impact they aspire to have on the world through the success of their business. So it is all about looking at a much wider range of stakeholders than simply shareholders, thinking about your employees, thinking about your customers, thinking about your supply chain, not just investors and the media. Gen Z, for example, is 3 times more likely than our generation to say that the purpose of business is to serve communities and society, and that they won't tolerate purpose washing, as we call it. So if you've got some idea that you can set up a few pages in your annual report where you talk about purpose, but you haven't actually instilled it in the way your company makes its products or services and operates, and in its culture, Gen Z is going to see through that very quickly, and you'll have a problem. Mm-hmm. The good news is, I think the purpose creates in itself a massive opportunity for business in implementing a new way of doing business in support of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And you'll see letters coming out of the leader of BlackRock, who has been a long-time proponent of sustainability in business and purpose, every year getting stronger and stronger on this subject. So that's, I think, what they're looking for from leaders in relation to purpose. In relation to inclusivity, it's more obvious. So we sort of have gone through this period of setting up diversity, and we sort of made quite a bit of progress, at least I would say, on gender. We're improving in other areas. We've still got a long way to go, but this generation is going to expect to see change. They simply expect the culture to be inclusive from day one in every respect, and people to be able to indulge their personal persona, their individual persona, without discrimination or any effect on their career. So that's the key thing.
What would you say that means at a practical level? So not necessarily at business leadership level, but if we go down to line management level, how does that purpose and that focus on inclusivity filter through in the way that leaders are engaging with their teams?
Well, what it means, I'm not sure this is quite the answer to your question, but it's the way I'm going to answer it. What it means is that it's no good having just simply a top-down, set of words and a mission statement that says this is our purpose and we are inclusive, right? I mean, that's very easy to say. What you actually need to do is to completely integrate it into the way you recruit, into the way you appraise, in the way that you pay. So your bonus system, if any, needs to reflect the values that you espouse. Your appraisal system needs to reflect it very overtly. In your training, it needs to be reflected in your promotion strategy. So every aspect of the way HR processes run a business needs to actually walk the talk, and reflect both purpose and inclusivity. Otherwise, people will see through it very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And from a career perspective, and this is probably something you've discussed with your own sons, but given that there's this idea of minimal commitment, about having not necessarily just a job and a set career, but different experiences, how do you see that influencing the career path that Gen Z take, and that balance between mastery in one or two areas versus breadth of experience across many different areas?
Well, one of the striking things that came to me from the 200 youngsters I met is that they're much less worried about failure, and they're much less worried about what I would call a sort of solid traditional career than we were. And that's not surprising, because we've told them, we've whinged on about austerity for 10 years. We've arguably screwed up the planet. And we're now handing this over to this generation. They're saying, okay, well, you've mucked this up. So we basically need to do our own thing. We're not going to rely on you lot. We're not going to go and work for some company for 5 to 10 years. That's 3 lifetimes at my age. So yeah, I'm prepared to come and work for you for 6 to 12 months, learn as much as I can, but I'm also going to be running my little business on the side, which might be a social enterprise. I'm going to have a side hustle. I'm going to be working on my own projects. And so they just have a completely different perspective on work, not just as a means to pay the bills, but as a way they spend some of their time. But they will look at it as something they do when they want, not necessarily when you want, that they may not do for too long before doing something else. It's all about training, learning, moving on, building experiences, building that personal brand. Mm-hmm. Which they're encouraged, and social media obviously builds up the idea of the social brand in many youngsters.
And on that note, how well equipped would you say that leaders and organizations are to actually recruit, manage, and source new talent, given that the turnover could be quite rapid if people are looking for those different experiences?
Well, I think the short answer to that is other than in the most advanced companies, a million miles away from it. I mean, I mentioned a couple of big companies that have started to think really hard about this, and of course there are many big companies who are in different ways thinking about it. But I would say the average company is way behind. I mean, I listened this year to 50 different graduates telling me the dreadful story of the way they go about applying for internships. They're one of 250 applicants. They get, they spend an hour filling in a specific application, then they get a 2-line email, and they never hear a result. I mean, I'll tell you a little story. There's a I won't say the name of the company, but it's a company that specializes in helping companies think about how to recruit graduates. And what happened was that a particular individual went through the process of applying to a very large asset management business, And the process was truly dreadful. And when he was telling his friend this story, the friend said, well, that's ridiculous. I'm sure I can organize a better way of doing it. So he designed a new way of them recruiting graduates, went to see the head of HR and said, you probably don't even know this, but if you apply to your company, this is what happens. And it was, as I said, truly appalling. What he did was he replaced that sort of laborious, form-filling, very impersonal experience with a lot of youngsters doing the recruiting. Very early on in the process, you actually talking to a human being about what it's like working at the company, the process that they were going to go through. So it was interactive, very, it was quick, it was personal, and it had youngsters in it, and it was based on personal experience. And cut a long story short, this person got hired to transform the graduate recruitment for that business. That is the kind of thinking, I think, that big companies, well, all companies are going to need if they're going to attract and retain Gen Z talent.
Yeah, a very interesting way to close that generation gap and understand the experience. And I'll just feed in a question here from a participant as well, because it's relevant to what we're discussing. But how do you actually build a great company culture when Gen Z employees are looking for those shorter term experiences? Because presumably it's harder to get that level of buy-in and commitment that creates that strong culture and brand.
I think the short answer to that is by involving them in the process. So, my favorite sort of example of this is Google, for example, has an average employee age of 29. Their board of directors average age is 62. The youngest person on their board is 47. That does not strike me as a company that wants any kind of challenge to its profit-making objectives. And indeed, every single member of the board is a multimillionaire, apart from one lady who is a microbiologist professor. So the one person they have who isn't a capitalist, right, isn't even from a discipline that would be relevant to challenging the business model of Google. I would imagine. Where is the child development psychologist? Where is the ex-media regulator? That doesn't look to me, and I may be judging them unfairly, but it doesn't look to me like a company that wants any challenge in terms of its business model. So the City UK, which I sit on the advisory board of, we just formed a sort of next generation board, as we call it, which is full of up and coming, potentially fast track youngsters. And we've asked them to consider exactly the issues that we consider at the main board. And we invite them to come and present at the board, and we try and listen to them and think about the way they're thinking about the world and build that into the way that we build the organizations. I think that's what we need to do. It's about engagement.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. And that idea of a shadow board is something that I've discussed with executives before, as you say, to provide a bit of counterbalance and challenge to their more conventional thinking sometimes. On a related note, a lot's been written about how human beings are still evolving and trying to keep up with the pace of technology and change, and actually that we haven't evolved quick enough to be able to do that and to process the vast volume of information. And we've seen a bit of a backlash in some places where people have been consciously switching off, or you can go to a restaurant where it blocks your phone signal. Do you think this is a bit of a trend or a fad, or do you think it's here to stay, and that type of approach that enables you to focus could actually become more mainstream? And maybe even as part of that, do you think, for example, mobile phones that are personal and connected to social media could be restricted or banned during office hours or in the workplace?
So I think it's here to stay, and I think the reason it's here to stay is that much of it is being driven by youngsters who've had digital overload or have had very significant negative impacts from social media or gaming or porn or all three. So one of the interesting things that sort of happened after I'd written my book is a whole load of people popped up saying, you're bang on the nose in terms of the issues, and here are some of the solutions. And I actually wish I'd met them before I'd finished the book, because I'd have had maybe this will be a second version of the book. But I met a load of youngsters and a lot of people working in what's known as the safety tech sector, which is people creating businesses that make the internet safer, not just safer to use, although it's called the safety tech sector. It's less distracting. And in the book, I do talk about the things that youngsters can do to self-regulate. I should say that realistically, if you have on one side of a screen a semi-developed adolescent brain, and on the other side of the screen 100 of the world's best neuroscientists trying to addict you, I don't think that's a fight that a lot of people are going to win, and we shouldn't expect them to, quite honestly. that leads you to what parents and educators do. And I think the whole idea that the central tension in many family households is around policing and restricting screen time is ill-judged, because it's not about screen time. This is one of the things I've learned from writing the book. I mean, if your child spends 9 hours on screens during a day, but that 9 hours is devoted to several hours of education where the only thing they're doing is actually educating themselves, or watching a film without also being on Instagram and Snapchat, or even gaming for an hour without doing 3 other things, that's probably all fine. If they spend the last 3 hours between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. idly scrolling through Instagram and Snapchat, that is much more, or 5 hours plus a day gaming, or a couple of hours a day on porn, that is all quite concerning. I could talk about it at length, it's all in the book, but it is not about screen time. All screen time is not equal, and all users are not equal. So you need to know what your child is doing when they're on the internet, and you need to think about the resilience or vulnerability of the particular child in the context of what they are experiencing. So I'll stop there, but in the book I talk about a lot about what parents and educators can do, which is fundamentally about involving yourself in your child's online life. So we tend to say to our kids, "What did you do today?" And they say, "I went to the park and played football with John," or, "I went and played tennis with Brian," or, "I went for a drink," or whatever. We don't say, "Okay, well, very interesting, but you haven't told me about the bulk of your day, which was, was 10 till 2 when you were chatting to your mates on Instagram." As a matter of, I mean, I'm not trying to pry, but what kind of things were you discussing, and what came up, and who were you talking to? We don't ask those questions because we think it's prying. Actually, the youngsters don't necessarily find it prying. It's just another aspect of their life. To them, actually, it is their life. And we should engage ourselves more in our children's online lives if we really want to understand them and help them.
Yeah, and I guess there is that challenge of how do you do that? It depends on the level of trust and the relationship you have with those.
Well, it isn't by telling them to get off their screens, which is what most people do. So I say police and restrict is not an approach that's going to win with a 17-year-old. It's going to tell you to sling your hook and find a way around whatever limits you impose on them.
As one of the participants has pointed out in the chat box, if we take our kids to a local park, we watch them very closely to make sure they're safe. How on earth do you find a parallel when they're online, sat in their bedroom on a phone?
Well, that 100% correct. We call it the predator in the home. We assume because the internet is generally accessed from a quote safe place, i.e. the child's bedroom, that when they're in their bedroom they're safe. Well, that's a fundamentally wrong assumption. The internet is an infinitely more dangerous place than the park or the high street, and we wouldn't let them go there on their own if they were 14 without an older friend or a brother or sister. And yet we do allow them to roam around the internet with exposure to deeply age-inappropriate content on a regular basis. So yes, that is a big challenge. So the answer to your friend's question, I think, is the following. It's not about programs that snitch on the child to the parent. I think that sets up the wrong dynamic. There are products which empower the child and educate the child. So there's a BBC app, which one of the companies I work with actually developed, called Own It, which sits on the keyboard of your device. And when the child is about to use an expletive because they've typed it but they haven't yet sent it, or they're about to send a body image, it will just say, "Oh, hold on, before you do that, here's a reason why you might not want to do that." It'll explain the concept of revenge porn, or why expletives. I mean, just look at what's happening today with cricketers and footballers, for example, right? I mean, there it is. And actually, that's a very good way of explaining it, because that's something they'll understand. Can come back to haunt you, and the app does that. It doesn't stop you ultimately from sending it. If having read it and thought about it, you still want to go, then that's fine, but it does educate and empower the child as to why that might be a bad idea. So that's one way of doing it. If it's gaming you're worried about, then there are very good Xbox, which is the biggest manufacturer I think in the world, has very good software which will just simply print a report once a week which shows the activity that happened, and it will focus on things like loot boxes, whether the people in the chat were actually in the child's contact group or whether they were from outside, which happens a lot. So there are all sorts of things you can do that aren't in the sort of snitching and surveillance category, but are helping you understand what's going on, and then maybe enable you to have a more informed conversation with your child about how to regulate their internet use.
Interesting stuff. And just to bring us back to the workplace, another question from a participant is, in terms of recruiting Gen Z, do you think there'll still be a focus on traditional metrics such as university, education, successes and sort of previous brand names or organizations you've worked with? Or do you think there'll be a different set of metrics that employers will look for that determine or help to predict success?
I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer, if I'm brutally honest. I mean, I think we've already seen a change, haven't we? I mean, if I think back to banking when I started out, we probably focused way too much on the Russell Group universities. Actually, because I didn't go to one, I went to Bath University when I was chairman of Merrill Lynch. I said, why are we so bothered about these 5 universities when, you know, by definition, because I've just become the chairman, some good people must come out of these second-tier universities. I said, and anyway, everybody else is focused on the top 5. So why don't we go for the next 5, and then we'll be able to pick the cream of the crop from those 5 universities in a much more efficient way. So I think we've all, you know, that's just one example, but I think we've already changed in the way we look at graduates. Of course, we've got many more universities. What used to be science colleges are now universities. You know, tech colleges all became universities, and it's become one big amorphous. So actually, weeding out talent in that with that degree of supply is more complicated. As to how we do it in the future, I'm not sure I'm qualified. I mean, you should answer that question probably. That's your business, not mine. I'd be interested to know what you think. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer this, but I think it will be different metrics, yes.
Yeah, and I suspect we'll see an interest or a growing interest in a blend of skills and experiences rather than people that come from a single vertical career path.
Well, one thing we do look at, I think, is, I mean, anybody who turns up without having done about 3 internships is by definition, you know, not as ambitious as the next person. And I think, you know, I'm staggered when I meet 20-year-olds that they've already had 3 jobs in 3 different cities on 2 different continents. I mean, this was unimaginable when I was 17 or 18, but now it seems to be almost the norm, at least for a certain part of society. So yeah, I think we will develop different metrics, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to tell you exactly what they are.
Yeah, I think it will become about how we leverage that experience in really positive ways, rather than seeing it as a limiting factor, which I think it has been seen as in the past. Just a final question from me before I pass back to Stuart, and a slightly more future-focused question. So, understandably, at the moment, the focus is on Gen Z for good reasons. But when we look at the next generation following Gen Z and the generation that's going to be entering work after them, do you have any insights, Robert, into how their expectations and approach may differ, or perhaps how similar they will be?
Well, so we're talking about Generation Alpha, I think, as it's going to be called. We're talking basically about 5 and under at this point. So I'm not sure I do have any insights on that. It must be the next book, mustn't it? I haven't actually seen a book yet about Generation Alpha. There must be one. Again, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I think it's a bit early as it relates to their view of the workplace. And I think about my own youngest teenage son. He's only just beginning to ask questions now in his mid-teens about work and what work means and what does a chairman do, Dad, for him, which, by the way, is a really difficult one. If anybody's got a good answer to what a chairman does, I'd be grateful to receive it, because I can't explain it. So yeah, I'm not sure I can tell you what generation is Alpha, but I think it'll be a progression. It'll be a progression of what we see in Gen Z, with no doubt, a bit like every generation does, with no doubt some reaction to it, right? It'll depend how well does Gen Z do, given its views in actually stewarding a better sense of corporate purpose and a repair of the planet. It'll, you know, depends how successful the generation is in how Generation Alpha will react, I think.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff, Robert. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Stuart now, but it's been a pleasure. So yeah, thank you again.
Pleasure, thanks.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Robert, as well. So thanks for sharing all your thoughts and experiences. Even though I've read the book, it's been insightful and so expanding on some of the points there. So I'm sure there'll be people wanting to follow up with you directly and potentially buy a book as well. I know we've discussed that particular exit, Robert. So where can they find you?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn. That's easy. I'm just Robert Wigley on LinkedIn. I look forward to connecting with anybody that wants to interact on this or any other subject that we've discussed. In relation to the book, it's available through my website, which is www.robertwigley.uk. If you want the proceeds to go to charity. If you simply want ease of purchase and you're already a Gen Z at heart, then you can go to Amazon, Kindle or Audible, depending on which kind of format you like to consume your books via. I would tell you though, if you go to any of those three, £7.70 goes to charity, whereas if you buy it through my website, £20 goes to charity, and that, I'm afraid, is the power of the monopoly, which is Amazon. But there we go. That's the way it is.
That's the way it is. But we'll be sending around a follow-up after the event, which will include links as well. I'm sure people will try and reach out to you directly. But thank you once again, Robert. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And we'll now be closing the webinar.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.